The mailbox was full. That's where it started. Or that's where I started noticing, which might not be the same thing. A Tuesday evening in November, and I'd just come in from work with my bag over one shoulder and my keys already out because I always forget something if I don't do it in the right order. Keys, mail, elevator. Otherwise, I'm riding back down at 9 p.m. for a water bill. So I was doing the thing I always do, pulling open box 14A, and I happened to look at the one next to mine. Box 14B. Full. Not like someone hadn't checked their mail in a few days. Full in the way that means weeks. The envelope stacked and bent, and someone had given up trying to fit more through the slot and just laid a few on top of the box. They had that particular yellowing at the edges that fluorescent light does to paper over time. The kind of yellowing that meant those envelopes had been sitting there long enough to change color from a light source they were exposed to for maybe 4 hours a day. I stood there with my water bill and a catalog I'd never signed up for, and I looked at those envelopes. Then I looked down the hall at the door to 14B. Then I looked through the lobby window at the parking lot, where Karen's silver Honda had been sitting in the same spot for 3 weeks. I knew it was 3 weeks because that's how long it had been since Ray, the guy from the first floor, told me she'd left. We were in the elevator together. He'd said it the way you say things in elevators. No eye contact, directed at the panel of floor buttons, filling the 40 seconds between the lobby and the second floor. Karen moved out, he'd said. Got a job somewhere else, I think. Just like that. 40 seconds and a button press and we were at my floor and I got out and that was the whole conversation. That had been 3 weeks ago. I looked at the mailbox. At the door at the end of the hall. At the silver Honda through the window. Karen didn't have anywhere to go in another city. Her mother lived 8 blocks from here. Her sister was in the same suburb where they'd both grown up, 40 minutes out. Karen had lived in this building for 12 years. I knew that because she'd mentioned it once. The way you mention things to people in hallways, briefly and without particular emphasis. The kind of information that passes between neighbors who are friendly but not friends. 12 years in this building. Her whole adult life in this city. People who have somewhere to go don't leave their cars. I stood there a little longer than I should have, which is probably the first sign that something in me had already decided this wasn't right, even before my brain caught up with the conclusion. Then I put my mail in my bag and went upstairs and made dinner. Let me back up a little. Let me tell you who Karen was to me and who I was to her, which is the same thing, just from opposite sides. We were hall neighbors, 14A and 14B. For 6 years we had passed each other in the morning, nodded and said good morning, occasionally exchanged a few sentences about the weather or the construction on the next block over, or the fact that the elevator had been making a sound like something was wrong with its pulleys for approximately 3 months before anyone did anything about it. We were the kind of friendly that happens automatically from proximity. The kind where if you see someone at a grocery store, you'd stop and talk for a few minutes, but you don't have each other's numbers, and if they disappeared, you might not notice for a while. That's the thing about being hall neighbors. You see someone almost every day, but you see them as part of the landscape. Karen belonged to this hallway the way the light fixture at the end of the hall belonged to it, the way the slightly scuffed baseboard by the elevator belonged to it. She was part of the texture of the place. I work as a project coordinator for a construction company, which means my entire job is tracking sequences and noticing when something is off schedule without explanation. When a permit hasn't come back and the contractor says it's fine, don't worry, I'm the person who keeps a note of it and follows up in 2 days. When a delivery is marked complete, but the materials aren't on site, I'm the one who traces the gap. I'm not a detective. I don't think of myself as someone with particularly sharp instincts. I'm just someone whose job has trained her to notice when a chain has a broken link and to not stop thinking about it until she understands where the break is. That's why, standing there with the water bill and the yellowed envelopes, something in my brain made a small sound like a flag going up. I went upstairs. I made pasta. I watched something on my laptop that I couldn't tell you anything about now. And at some point, without deciding to, I thought about the Honda again. I should tell you about the last time Karen and I actually talked. Really talked, more than a greeting. It was 8 months before she disappeared. A Sunday morning in March, early enough that the air still had that particular cold behind warm quality that March does before 9 o'clock, and I was going out for coffee. I came out of the lobby and Karen was standing by her car, bent into the trunk looking for something. I never found out what. She straightened up when she heard the door and we just started talking. I don't even remember how. One of those conversations that happens when you're both outside in the morning and there's no agenda, and for once you have a few minutes. We talked about the trottoir repair on Hanover Street that had finally happened after 2 years of everyone complaining about it. We talked about something I'd said, I can't even remember what, something dumb, probably self-deprecating about not being a morning person, and she laughed at it. Not politely. Actually laughed. The kind that comes out before you decide whether to. She seemed easy in herself that morning. Happy, or at least fine, which is its own kind of happiness. When we said goodbye, she said, "By the way, you always say hi in the hallway. Like you mean it. You notice that about someone." I thought, what a nice thing to say. I thought, I like her. I wish we'd gotten to know each other better. We never talked like that again. I didn't think about that Sunday morning again until much later, until I was sitting on my kitchen floor at 2 a.m. with a laptop screen going dim because I'd stopped moving and it had timed out, and I understood what she might have meant by it. But that comes later. Everything comes later. First, I have to tell you about the mailbox, and the Honda, and what I started to put together one piece at a time over the next 10 weeks. The building I live in is a mid-size apartment complex. Not huge, 40-something units across 6 floors. I've been there 6 years, and I know it the way you know a place when you've lived in it long enough that you stop looking at it but haven't stopped seeing it. I know which stairs creak. I know that the dryer on the 2nd floor takes 12 minutes longer than it should because of something with the vent that maintenance has addressed twice and not fixed. I know the sound the lock on 14B makes when it opens. A specific click, a little sharper and higher than mine, audible in the hallway when it's quiet. I know who says good morning and who stares at their phone in the elevator, and who props the lobby door open when they're bringing groceries in, even though there are 2 signs asking residents not to. I know the parking lot the way I know it. I see it twice a day, coming and going. Karen's silver Honda Civic was in spot 23, had been in spot 23 for the 3 years I'd been paying attention to it, which is to say, as long as I'd noticed it at all. It was not a remarkable car. It was the kind of car you could walk past 100 times and not register. I registered it as Karen's car the way I registered the light fixture as the light fixture. Not as an object of interest, just as a fixed point in the landscape. When she supposedly left, the Honda stayed in spot 23. Week 1, I barely noticed. Week 2, I noticed it was still there and thought nothing in particular. Week 3, Ray told me she'd moved, and that's when the Honda went from part of the landscape to something I kept looking at every time I passed. I want to be honest about my mental state in those first few weeks, because I've told this story enough times in my own head that I want to make sure I don't clean it up. I was not certain anything was wrong. I had a feeling, and a feeling is not a fact, and I've been wrong about feelings before in ways that cost me things I didn't get back. So I was careful. I kept telling myself the things you tell yourself. Maybe she took a flight and left the car to deal with later. Maybe it broke down right before she moved and she hadn't gotten around to it. Maybe the parking spot is paid through the end of the month. Maybe I just don't know enough about her life to know what's normal for her. I kept telling myself these things. The problem was that none of them quite held their shape when I pressed on them. So, week 4. I did something practical. I went to the management office for the building. Not with accusations. I want to be clear about that, because I can imagine how this sounds from the outside, and I was very aware of how it sounded even from the inside. I went with a practical question, the kind of question a reasonable person might ask. I said, "The parking spot for 14B has a car in it that's been there for about a month, and I understand the resident moved out. What happens to a resident's parking spot when they leave? Is there a waiting list?" I was asking because I have a friend who needs parking sometimes. I was not trying to investigate anything. I was trying to get a conversation going without announcing that I thought something was wrong because I didn't have anything concrete enough to say out loud. The building manager, his name was Kellner, Phil Kellner, a man in his late 50s who had always been civil to me and who I had no particular feelings about either way, looked up from his desk and said the spot was currently in a kind of administrative limbo while they waited for confirmation of lease termination. I said, "So you haven't received official notice of her leaving?" He said, "We received verbal notification from a relative of the tenant." From a relative? Not from Karen, from someone calling on her behalf. I kept my voice very even. I said, "Did you follow up with her directly to confirm?" He looked at me for a moment, not like I'd said something alarming, more like I was being slightly tedious. He said, "The tenant vacated without lease violations. As far as this office is concerned, that's the extent of our involvement." I said thank you and left. In the elevator on the way up, I had a small argument with myself. On one side, management offices get calls from relatives all the time. People ask their siblings or parents to handle logistics. Karen might have been in the middle of a move and asked someone to make the call so she didn't have to deal with one more thing. Completely plausible. Completely normal. On the other side, she'd been in this building 12 years and apparently didn't leave a forwarding address and left a car and a full mailbox, and the only confirmation of her departure was one phone call from someone Kellner described as a relative. From a relative. I kept trying to remember if Karen had ever mentioned someone, a brother, a family friend, anyone who might call on her behalf. I came up with nothing specific, but I also didn't know her well enough to say with confidence that no such person existed. That's the thing I kept running into. I didn't know enough to prove it either way. And "I don't know enough" is not a reason to go to the police and say I think my neighbor's disappearance wasn't what it looked like. So I kept the information, and I kept going to work, and I kept walking past 14B twice a day and listening for the click of the lock and hearing nothing. About 2 weeks after the conversation with Kellner, I was in the first floor laundry room folding things. This was a Saturday morning, maybe 9:30, and Margaret from the third floor came in. Margaret has lived in this building longer than anyone I know of. She's in her mid-60s, retired, and she has the particular quality of someone who has watched everything that's happened in a place for a long time without announcing that she's watching. We'd always gotten along. We'd talked at the mailboxes, in the lobby, with that easy neighbor friendliness that requires no maintenance and no obligation. We started talking the way we always did, about nothing in particular. At some point, Karen came up. I let it come up. I'd been letting her come up in any conversation where it might arise naturally, just to hear what people said. Margaret said something interesting. She said, Karen had been thinking about leaving for a long time. She always seemed like someone carrying something the last year or so. I asked, "What do you mean?" Margaret looked at her laundry. She said, "Just sometimes people look like they have a weight. You know." I said, and I don't know why I said it this way. I don't know where the name came from in that moment because I'd only heard it once in passing, from a neighbor who didn't realize she was giving me anything. I said, "With Devon?" Margaret stopped. She looked at me for just a moment longer than she needed to. She said, "I don't know that name." But she stopped before she said it. The pause was less than a second. Someone else might not have noticed, but I was watching, the way you watch when you're waiting for information, and she stopped, just for a fraction of a second, and then she said she didn't know the name. I walked out of the laundry room and stood in the hallway. My chest was doing something, not fear exactly, more like recognition. The physical sensation of something clicking into place whether you want it to or not. She knew the name. I was almost certain of it. She knew the name and she decided she didn't. Which meant one of two things. Either Margaret had a specific reason to stay away from this, to not be involved, to see nothing and say nothing, or she was protecting someone who had hurt Karen, and she'd made that calculation out loud in a laundry room without knowing I was listening for it. I should have pushed. I should have come back in and asked again from a different angle. I didn't. I stood in the hallway and understood something about why I didn't. Because if she confirmed it, I would have something concrete enough that I couldn't keep it quiet and keep telling myself I might be wrong. And some part of me was still holding on to being wrong. Wrong would mean Karen was somewhere starting over. Wrong would mean 12 years in this building had ended in a new beginning, not in something I didn't want to name. Wrong was still available to me. I held on to it for 2 more weeks. Then I went to see Karen's mother. Her name was Patricia, and she lived in a small ground-floor apartment on Delmar Street, 8 blocks from our building. I'd gotten her address from... Actually, I'd gotten it from a misdirected piece of mail that had come to Karen's mailbox once, years ago, before Karen and I were even on regular speaking terms. One of those pieces of information that sits in the back of your mind doing nothing for years until the moment it becomes useful. I rang her bell on a Thursday evening in December, and she answered the door in a cardigan and reading glasses, and looked at me with the polite wariness of someone who gets unexpected visitors. I said I was Karen's neighbor. I said we'd been friendly for years, and I was just checking in. I hadn't seen her in a while. Patricia let me in immediately. Her apartment was full of plants, the kind of small, careful collection that someone has been cultivating for a very long time. African violets and a peace lily on the windowsill. A large philodendron that had clearly been there for years, trailing along the top of a bookshelf. She made tea without asking whether I wanted it, and sat across from me at her kitchen table, and talked about Karen the way mothers talk about daughters they're not quite in contact with at the moment, with a practiced reassurance covering something quieter underneath. She said, Karen always goes quiet when she's upset, since she was a girl. They'd had an argument before she left, something about a decision Karen had made, and Karen had left without saying goodbye, and that was how it always went. She'd come back when she was ready. She'd come back. She always did. I listened to all of this. I held my tea. And then I asked, without planning to, have you spoken to Devin since she left? Patricia looked at me. She said, who? I said, the man she was living with. Patricia set her cup down. She looked at me for a moment that had a different quality than anything else in the conversation. Not confused, not startled, but still, in a way that meant something. She said, Karen lives alone. She's always lived alone. I sat with that. Either Patricia didn't know about Devin, which meant Karen had kept him hidden from her own mother, deliberately and for a long time. Or Patricia knew and was telling me she didn't know, in which case she was protecting something. I couldn't figure out which was true. I couldn't figure out which was worse. Both of them meant the same thing at the bottom. A woman had been living a hidden life, or a life that had been hidden for her, and the people who should have been able to see it either couldn't or wouldn't. I said thank you for the tea. I drove home. I sat in my car in the parking lot for about 10 minutes, looking at spot 23 where the Honda still was, because it was still there, 11 weeks out, and then I went inside. I want to tell you what I did next, because it's the part that I'm most clear-eyed about now. My job is about paperwork. I know this about myself, and I know it about the world. When official channels fail, they usually fail because no one made the formal request, because everyone assumed someone else would do it, because the information existed in pieces that no single person held at once. I'm not a detective, and I'm not law enforcement. What I am is someone who knows how to pull a thread. I started with what I knew about Devin. I'd gotten his last name from a neighbor. Again, a detail I'd heard once and not attended to at the time, so I had a full name. I spent an evening searching public records, the way anyone can, because we live in a time when a surprising amount of legal history is available online if you know how to look. Civil court filings mostly. Landlord-tenant disputes, small claims, that kind of thing. What I found was not a criminal record. It was a civil protective order from 3 years ago, filed by a woman in another city, issued, and then, 3 months later, withdrawn. Withdrawn by the woman who filed it. I sat with that for a long time. Because here's the thing about a protective order that gets withdrawn. The police see a person who had a complaint and changed their mind. Maybe she reconciled with him. Maybe she moved on and didn't want the hassle of following through. Maybe she was afraid of what would happen if she didn't withdraw it. The record shows the order, and then the withdrawal, and then nothing. And the nothing looks like resolution. But it's not resolution. It's a woman who, for whatever reason, decided she couldn't follow it through. And Devin had been in this building for however long, and had been with Karen for however long, and now Karen had moved away based on a single phone call from someone Kellner described as a relative, and her car was in spot 23, and her mother thought she lived alone. I sat on my kitchen floor. I don't know when I moved from the couch to the floor. I just noticed at some point that I was there, back against the cabinet under the counter, laptop closed on the tile beside me. The kind of sitting down that isn't a choice, it's a consequence. I thought about that Sunday morning in March, about Karen leaning into her trunk, about her laughing at something I said, really laughing, About what she'd said when we said goodbye. You always say hi in the hallway, like you mean it. You notice that about someone. She said it to me. Not to her mother, not to her sister, not to a friend. To the woman from 14A who said good morning every day and knew nothing about her actual life. And I had heard it as a compliment and gone to get my coffee. I want to be clear. I'm not responsible for what happened to Karen. I know that. It was not my job to see something that she hadn't asked me to see, that she might not have wanted me to see. But there was a woman who filed a protective order 3 years ago and withdrew it. And there was Karen, who maybe knew about that woman or maybe didn't. And there was me, with my good morning and my 6 years in the hallway. A chain of women who had information and stopped, each for her own reasons, each doing the calculation about what she could do and what she couldn't, and deciding she couldn't. I was the next one in the chain. I sat there until the screen on my laptop timed out from inactivity. Then I sat in the dark for a little while. Then I thought, okay, stop. Think. What do you have? You have a woman who left no forwarding address, left her car, whose departure was communicated by a phone call from someone identified only as a relative, whose mother was unaware she'd ever lived with anyone. You have a protective order in another city, filed against a man with the same name as the man who had been living with Karen, and withdrawn 3 months later by the woman who filed it. You have a building manager who closed the file on a verbal notification. You have a neighbor who knew a name she said she didn't know. What do you not have? You don't have anything that proves what you think it proves. You have pieces that fit together in a way that makes one picture, but pieces can always fit together in more than one way, and you have been wrong before, and the cost of being wrong here is real. Patricia was waiting for her daughter to come back. She'd been waiting for months. She had her tea and her plants and her practiced reassurance, and she was waiting for a reconciliation that might not be coming. If I went to the police with what I had, and it turned out to be nothing, Karen had left voluntarily, Karen was fine, Karen had reasons for everything that I didn't know about, I would have put Patricia through another cycle of official inquiry, and the particular grief of hope raised and lowered for no reason. I would have caused harm with my instincts. If I didn't go, and I was right, then I had done what the woman with the protective order had done, and what everyone else had done, which was calculate the risk of being wrong and stop. I thought about that for a long time. I got up. I opened the laptop. The screen came back on. I need to tell you about the elevator first, because it happened 2 days before I did anything with what I knew, and because it's the thing I come back to most often. I was coming home from work on a Tuesday evening, which is the same time of week I'd first noticed the mailbox, almost 2 months earlier. I was in the lobby checking my mail. 14A, water bill, nothing notable, when I heard the elevator and stepped over to catch it. The doors opened and there was a man inside. He was in his mid-40s. Average height, average build, the kind of nondescript that is its own description, the kind you'd describe to someone later and keep revising because you realize you're describing everyone and no one. But I knew his face. I'd found a photo from a social media profile that hadn't been taken down, and I'd looked at it long enough that I knew it, the way you know something you've been looking for. He held the elevator for me, the polite gesture of someone who lives in a building and expects to be found polite. He said good evening. He said he was up on the 4th floor, had just moved in recently, still figuring out the rhythms of the place. He asked how long I'd been in the building. 6 years, I said. He said, oh, then you must have known Karen. Such a shame she moved. She seemed like such a quiet person. He said it absolutely normally, the way you say anything about a neighbor who's left. Mild regret, no weight behind it. His voice was the most ordinary thing I'd heard in weeks. The elevator opened at my floor. I stepped out. I said, yeah, it's too bad. The doors closed. I stood in the hallway. He said, quiet person. Not quiet, quieter. A comparative without its other term. Quieter than what? Quieter than when? Quieter than before something, or than she used to be, or than the beginning, or than when she was still able to be anything else. I know how this sounds. I know a slip in grammar doesn't mean anything, that people speak imprecisely all the time, that I was already looking for patterns and my brain was finding them whether they were there or not. I know all of that. But I stood in that hallway and I could not let it go. It sat in me like a stone, that comparative with no comparison, and I thought, he knows I've been here 6 years. He knows I knew her. He said it to me specifically. I went inside. I did not sleep well. In the morning, I got up and I made coffee, and I sat down at my kitchen table and I opened a document and I started writing. Here's what I wrote. I wrote it like a memo, because that's the format I think in when I need to be accurate and unemotional. I wrote a timeline. When I last saw Karen. When Ray told me in the elevator that she'd moved. When I first noticed the mailbox. When the car was still there. When I spoke to Kellner, what he said about the relative who called. When I spoke to Margaret and what she said about carrying something, and the pause before she said she didn't know his name. When I visited Patricia, what she said about the argument and the reconciliation that always came, and what she said, or didn't say, about Karen living alone. The civil protective order, the filing date, the issuance, the withdrawal, Devin's name, age, prior address from the public rental records. The car, still in spot 23 as of that morning. I wrote it out completely, every detail, every source. Then I read it back. On its own, each thing has an explanation. The car could have been left for any number of reasons. The relative could be a real relative. Patricia might not have known about Devin because Karen had reasons for keeping him separate from her family. Margaret might genuinely not have known the name. I'd heard it once from a neighbor who mentioned it in passing, so it wasn't publicly known. The protective order was withdrawn, which is a fact that the courts recorded as resolution. But together they described something. A woman who had been systematically made invisible, even in the official account of her own departure. A phone call that generated a closed file without a single follow-up to the person it was supposedly about. A man who had access to her apartment, access to her life. Access to the narrative of what had happened to her, and a grammar slip that might mean nothing. That I could not let go. I went to the missing persons unit, not the regular non-emergency line. I'd called a contact at the police department, a woman named Gina Ferris, who I knew tangentially through a friend, and I asked her the right way to submit a formal request for a welfare investigation. She didn't ask me why. She told me to put it in writing and request it as a formal inquiry with documented concerns, and to be specific about what was already on record. So I was specific. I sent the report I'd written, with everything attached that was attachable, the public court record, the rental registration, a note about the verbal-only notification of departure that the building had on file, the fact of the car. I sent it to the missing persons unit at the precinct that covered our neighborhood, with a formal request for a welfare check and an investigation into Karen's whereabouts. Then I wrote a second letter, not to the police, to Patricia. I didn't tell her everything. I couldn't, not without knowing more than I knew, and not without having the ability to sit with her while she heard it, which I was not the right person to do. I wrote one paragraph. I said, if you haven't heard from Karen in more than a few weeks, there is a formal process through which a concerned family member can request a welfare investigation. I gave her the address and the case number for what I'd already filed. I said, you don't have to do anything with this, but I wanted you to know the option exists. I sealed the envelope. I walked down to the lobby. I put it in the outgoing mail. And then I went out the front door and stood in the parking lot and looked at spot 23, empty. It had been empty for 3 months. Someone had come one Wednesday morning and moved the car, and by the time I noticed it was gone, there was nothing to notice, just a parking spot. I stood there for a minute, then I went to work. 2 weeks later, Gina Ferris called me. She said, the report you submitted has been referred for active investigation. She couldn't tell me more than that. I said, okay. She said, that's not nothing. I said, I know. I want to be careful about what I say next, because I don't want to tell you something that isn't true or imply more than I actually know. What I know is that the investigation was opened. What I know is that Devin was no longer in the building by the end of January. Whether he left on his own or was asked to leave or was involved in something official, I can't tell you, because I don't know. What I know is that I passed Patricia on the street one afternoon in February, 2 blocks from her apartment, and she looked at me for a moment, and then she nodded. The kind of nod that carries information you can't put in a sentence. I don't know what the information was. I couldn't ask. What I know is that some things get answered and some things don't, and the ones that don't aren't less real for being unresolved. They just stay open, the way some things do. There's one thing I keep coming back to, one detail that never quite settled. The woman who filed the protective order 3 years ago, the one who withdrew it. I never found out who she was. I never tried. Her name wasn't in the public record, just the case number and Devon's name and the dates. And I decided not to look further, which I want to be honest about. I decided not to look because finding her would mean reaching out to a woman who had made a specific decision about how much she could carry and what she needed to put down. And that decision belonged to her. She had reasons. I don't know what they were. I don't think it's my place to open them back up. But I think about her. I think about the chain, about all the places where one more question might have changed something, and about why no one asked it, and about how many of those places were not failures of attention, but calculations of cost. She knew what following through would cost her. Karen might have known too. Margaret definitely knew something about knowing, and she made her own choice in a laundry room on a Saturday morning. I made mine. I can't tell you if it was enough. I can't tell you what was found or what wasn't, because I don't know. What I can tell you is that the investigation was opened, and that is more than a verbal notification and a closed file. That's what I have. On the way out of my apartment most mornings, I pass the mailboxes in the lobby. 14A, mine. 14B, still Karen's in my head. Always. The slot is empty now. There's no resident in that apartment yet. Or there wasn't as of the last time I really looked. Sometimes flyers get slipped in there anyway. The pizza promotion kind, addressed to current resident, because that's what bulk mail does. It goes everywhere regardless. Current resident. I stop sometimes, just for a second, at that row of mailboxes. I don't always know why I stop. There's nothing to see. Just metal doors and slots and fluorescent light doing its slow work on whatever gets left out too long. Some things you stop to mark, you can't name what you're marking. You just stop.